thanks for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. I have with me Sachin Jade. So Sachin, if you could give a little bit of background on yourself and Cyware.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, great to be here as well. So my background, Sachin Jade, I'm the Chief Product Officer for Cyware. Been in the risk and security space for most of my professional career in one way, shape, or form. For close to about 10 odd years, was more on the operations side, looking at what I defined back then called the security value at risk, which is when something happens from a security standpoint, as a company, what's the value at risk, whether it's the brand index, whether it's the equity value, and so on. How does that get impacted? So the real risk impact. After that, built my own firm, the early days of the EDRs, so to speak, of the world, and built a big data security platform around it. We got absorbed, and it was a nice exit, so to speak. Worked for some large corporates as well, identifying their P&L in terms of their security business lines and expanded, whether it was the zero trust world, the SASE world, figuring out identity and how identity plays a pretty key role. In one way or the shape or form, being with both on the public side and the private sector side. And then joined Cyware about 15, 16 months ago now. My charter is kind of threefold. One is definitely just the subject matter expertise around operations and security and how a customer uses products for security, because it's still a very emotional, at least from my standpoint, it's a very emotional thing, security. That's one. Second is how does the entire quote unquote new innovation trends that have to be incorporated appropriately. And third is very near and dear to my heart, which is collaborative or collective defense, or the cyber version of team of teams, if you will. So those are the three kind of key charters. Cyware itself, we are a CDC stage enterprise focused on what we call operationalizing threat intelligence, and that involve a whole bunch of different components underneath the covers. And so we've got a product suite of 4 products, but that's the core of it, which is how do we help the customers, analysts, associates, etc., and security analysts, CTI analysts. How do we help them make it very easy from an operationalization of threat intelligence? Spoke a lot, but thank you, Tony.
All right. No, I appreciate it. It's good background. So, one of the things, I've been, every podcast I've done, almost every article I've written for the last, year and a half to 2 years has been focused on AI. We went from, talking all about generative AI to all about agentic AI. And I think it's fair, the term gets tossed around, but I think it's fair to call AI a revolution at this point. I think it's transformative across silos. So I think it's fair to call it that. So, but as you just described, you've been with other companies, other startups. You've been around. From your perspective, is this different? What's different about this moment? Is it an AI revolution, or is that just hype?
Yeah, great question. So when I was building my first firm, which also involved a lot of data, and we needed to do a bunch of big data analysis in one way, shape, or form. Back then, we incorporated the quote unquote, most prevalent AI concept in that day, which was genetic algorithm. So we started building components out of genetic algorithm, and for 2 reasons. One was, how do you mimic a version of the enterprise's attack surface vector? And when you're mimicking that, almost like a digital twin concept, but back then all we called was the attack surface, digital domain. And out of that, then trying to figure out the different scenarios that the adversarial, components, the threat actors could be leveraging, and the gaps there are, and so on. The effort, both in terms of internal development that we had to do as a product company, and then the effort that the analyst had to go through to kind of make sense out of all of those things, even it was quote unquote AI, was quite exhaustive. It was kind of very high in terms of the barrier for somebody to understand it, make it in terms of something that can be achieved, something that can be interpreted appropriately, and so on. lo and behold, where we are today, almost like 15 years from where I built that firm, is if I had to kind of put the same concept in today's definition, it is much more easier in terms of developing that narrative. It's much more easier to leverage the models that are out there. I don't have to specifically write the entire model by myself. I can leverage a whole bunch of components underneath the covers. And so the shift for me is democratization of this capability in a much more easier fashion. And so the capability per cost, if I could leverage that kind of a mechanism, the capability per cost has dramatically increased in terms of getting more capability at a reduced cost point. And so that for me is a shift. There are still some challenges, but it absolutely is a transformational moment in my opinion.
Okay. Okay, so that makes sense. And but the other part, like I said, we went from generative AI to agentic AI, but the part that I left out there is that from a cybersecurity and technology perspective, like AI wasn't new. Like it wasn't invented when OpenAI came out with ChatGPT. It was in fact, it was already a buzzword. I mean, there were already vendors who were saying they were using AI when we could debate whether what that means and whether it was really AI. And I think that's still true. So I mean, it's a problem that goes beyond technology and cybersecurity to just marketing spin in general, I think. So now we're at a stage where like agentic AI is somewhere on everyone's slide deck. It's out there, but the definition of like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Can vary pretty dramatically. How would you explain agentic AI to customers, or like like in a way that gets beyond the buzzword to explain like, okay, well, what is that? What does this mean for me or for my company?
Oh, that's another fantastic question. So the way I describe it to my own team, as well as some of the prospects and customers and in the industry, is kind of breaking it into 3 levels, if you will. First level is any security that has to happen, quote unquote, is still a series of events across different subsystems and different people. And so which means the automation concept that has to be there, the workflow that has to be there, that's your first basis. No AI, it's just, just plain steps that has been well defined. The second element of the second evolution of this becomes the, hey, you know what, I need an AI capability somewhere here. So which means I have introduced the capability of reasoning to a certain extent, but it is still pretty defined from a step standpoint, saying it is your step to enrich. Yeah, within enrichment, you might define certain things that are the quote unquote AI node or the AI step makes a decision by itself. Great, sounds good. Then the third layer is where the agentic, in my definition, starts to come in, which is in this series of events, now I have an objective. I actually don't know what the steps are that needs to be taken. And so you as an AI agent, kind of mimicking the human rationale or the human behavior, is to start figuring out, do I enrich it first? Do I not enrich it first? Do I create an adversarial scenario and simulate it and see, hey, you know what, is this truly a gap for me that I need to first enrich or not, and so on. So that is the definition of agentic, coming all the way from the foundation of an automation workflow. So that's how I define it, Tony.
Okay. I think, one of the things, and I think, you and I have talked about this in the past, but customers will often ask, and they're kind of building on what we just talked about. Customers will ask, "Is this relevant to me?" And followed with the very important question of, "What should I do next? What should I do about it?" From your perspective, why? How are those questions? How do other platforms fail to address those questions? And how do those questions help shape your strategy?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first and then I'll go on the first part. So being a very customer-centric individual, and I was at just the HISec Summit as well last week, My notion is very much a case of what are the problems you as a customer trying to solve, and where does AI really fit in? Instructor, who's also pretty well from the industry circles, Sergio, he and I were, discussing, chatting about certain things, and so on. And the commonality between what I was describing, what he was describing, what the students and the teacher and the participants were kind of adhering to was relevancy, 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 which is great. You're giving me a whole bunch of things, but is it relevant to me? Is this data let's say, classic example being you're giving me certain data about a firewall, but I don't even use that hardware as the firewall, or I don't even use that software as a firewall. Yeah, you may have obtained that from a alert or an advisory in the industry, in the open world, so to speak, but that's not relevant to me. So anything that we are building from within our products is the very first thought is how do I make the signal to noise ratio much more better for you as an analyst, so that you as an analyst can be efficient in terms of what you are supposed to do. So relevancy, relevancy, relevancy. The second aspect of that is as soon as the relevancy is brought in, and I do believe that, based on certain data that I can see that it is relevant to you, is giving you an identification of, I think these are the things that you should do as your next step. I still don't know if it's exactly the next step that you should be doing, but let me give you 2 or 3 recommended paths that you should be taking, so to speak. And last but not the least is for these 2 or 3 things, I can automatically define what that action is. For example, if I say that I think you should be patching XYZ, or I think you should be running a scenario around ABC, then I can create the Yara rules, or I can create the actual patching logic behind it and create it and say, hey, if you're going to go about this, this is the actual action, the code that you need to run. So that's how the strategy is being built, which is if the security analyst, the SOC analyst, the CTI analyst, is if this is how they typically do their job and the problems that they're facing, the challenges that they're facing, let's help them make that much better in our products. So that's how our strategy is getting defined. That's how we are evolving from the automation, agentic, every path, and infusing AI wherever we think is the right fit. Where the other products potentially might be faltering is they have this notion of that, there is when you take a classic SOC, L1, L2, L3, it's like, hey, L1 is the most important thing because the false positives, the higher number of triage that needs to be done at the alert. And so let's fix that in the first point, which is great. But what happens is very soon it goes to L2 and L3 in one way, shape, or so. And if that has not been addressed from that AI standpoint end to end, then they will get inundated because just by the very nature of the value chain. So that's how we look at it, which is the whole stack, and saying, what, where is it that the individual is doing his or her job, and what is this that the AI needs to help out? So that's how our purview is.
Okay. Well, so and that touched on something, from a cybersecurity perspective, and from a cybersecurity journalism perspective, things like like zero-day attacks and nation-state attacks are they're sexy, they make for good headlines. But the reality has always been that those are anomalous. Those are not the attacks that are actually impacting companies on a day-to-day basis. So similarly here, I feel like there are agentic AI use cases or agentic AI features and benefits that are sexier, that are that people like to focus on. But the reality, it seems to me, and I think it falls in line with kind of what you were just describing, that a lot of the value is really in just being able to filter and contextualize threat intel in really kind of a almost mundane way, and it's like it doesn't need to be flashy to be valuable. So I guess I would be curious about your thoughts there. Actually, let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. Yes, sure. Yeah. So I was doing this demonstration during the summit, and a few of the prospects, a few of the customers came by, and my question to them was like, hey, where are the pieces where I need to introduce certain things that will make your life easy, so to speak? One of the use cases that was brought by one of our customers, which was echoed by some of the other prospects as well, was every morning, me as the analyst, I have to look at a whole bunch of alerts and advisories, whether they're coming from our own internal systems or somebody else is sending it from an ISAC standpoint. But then I have to somehow do due diligence on these, figure out what is important to me, figure out what is important to my business stakeholder, which could be in the fraud space on the other side, or it could be in the physical security side, and so on. And every morning, very much like the classic CIA's thought process, which is I've got a direct connection with the stakeholder, so I need to do certain things, and then I need to sit with that individual on the other side from a business standpoint and say, hey, these are the attacks that might be happening. What do you want to do with it? What are your remediation steps that you encourage? Let me then go back and so on. But because of the noise that is there so much in terms of what exactly do I do with so much data that is coming in, every ask was about, hey, can you now reduce this to what you think is these top 5, top 3 relevant items? Give me all the others as well, because if something does come in, I don't want to lose sight of it. But then along with that, give me the recommendations so that when I go every morning, when I sit with my stakeholder on the other side, I can walk through these 3 or 4 without having to do a whole bunch of analysis by myself. It gives me the summarization. It gives me the possible attack scenarios that a threat actor typically does. And these are all the mitigation that you could happen. And identify that, hey, these are all the breach places that it could impact based on the attack surface vector that I already have. So we had introduced this in the past as well, the relevancy concept. And so they looked at it and they're like, yes, when we used to do it before, it was so painful. And now because of this, I can actually make it more concise. I can have that conversation pretty nice with the business stakeholder, which allows me to do a whole bunch of other tasks and activities specifically focused on when the stakeholder says, hey, if this is the impact, can you tell me what all the other things that we should be thinking about? So more strategically, I can start thinking as opposed to complete tactical. So this is what they loved it. And to your point, Tony, a lot of the elements that we're bringing in is about the customers or the analysts basically doing most of the mundane stuff that they spend a lot of effort on.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I feel like, when companies do, when the OpenAIs and Googles and Metas of the world do their demos, they obviously the goal is to impress, and so they'll show off a scenario that is impressive, assuming that the demo goes off right. But it's also not necessarily the most valid use case or the most valuable use case, and then like I said, so I think it's true that like part of the value, especially from a SOC perspective and a threat intel perspective, is that we've traditionally had level 1 entry level analysts come in and be like, all right, well, your job is to slog through everything and help us connect the dots and figure out and then let the level 2 people know what seems relevant for them to actually focus on. And that's important work. Somebody needs to do that. But it's also boring and routine and mundane, and the scale and volume are hard to keep up with, which are all things that AI and agentic AI seem uniquely qualified for. Like that's perfect. Let the AI do that.
Yeah, no, 100%. And so the way our roadmap and our feature sets and strategy that I have is broken into what I call the essential components and then what I call the tip of the spear, right? 80% of it is in, 70 to 80% of it is in this quote unquote mundane space, the non-sexy piece, which is like, hey, you know what, this is needed and so on. The tip of the spear is something that is at the, hey, this is pretty interesting, might not be used significantly on a day-to-day basis, but there is a pretty high impact if this happens once in some time, and it can be leveraged. And case in point being, run through like 5 or 6 different adversarial scenarios and tell me like, hey, you know what, this is the highest probability scenario of the next attack path in the attack chain. So that might not happen every single day, so to speak. But hey, we're on level 2, level 3 basis. Somebody might want to do that research in a particular capacity. So we have that tip of the spear concept, and then the majority of this agentic on the other side. We have seen the usage, which is most of it is in the summarization, identification, relevancy, correlation, contextualization, etc. But we also see every now and then people using the tip of the spear. It also gives us some interesting feedback to say, when does the shift start to happen, which is, hey, you know what, the table stakes are now getting covered significantly and nicely. When are all the other things which used to be now tip of the spear, when should that start becoming table stakes as well?
I want to take a step back and so one of the things you mentioned when you were kind of setting the table in the first place was this team of teams concept, and I've talked with you about that before, but I think it's, I want to bring it up in this podcast, the idea that we've got the and I'm not trying to pick on ChatGPT, but we've got the ChatGPTs of the world of where it's like they've trained it on the internet at large, and it's both sort of presented as and expected to be this all-knowing oracle of it has all of the information in the world. But I think there are examples on a pretty much daily basis of like why that's can be both a pro and a con. It's like well, it on the one hand, well, that sounds great. If I have a resource that literally knows all of the information and can answer any question, great. But if anyone who's spent more than 5 minutes on the internet will tell you a lot of the information on the internet isn't right. And so training something on all of the information on the internet has problems as well. And when with Cyware, like you guys have taken this focus of the multi-agent model, and instead of one big sort of monolithic AI that is going to do everything, breaking it into, okay, well, let's have different AIs that are really good at what they do, and then figure out how to make them all work together to achieve the goal that we're going for. So talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. Spot on. Originally, we when we started doing some analysis, the hypothesis very much was governed towards, if I am trying to mimic the human security analyst persona, so to speak, there is no one individual that is an Uber know-all in the company, so to speak, anyways. So which means you are breaking the functionality. And so from a functional decomposition standpoint, the agent should also be able to mimic that capacity. And so we did the multi-agent where underlying, we can use some of the foundational models that have been built, but the data that it gets used to be leveraged, both from a vector standpoint and the metadata concept, is specifically governed by that context within the quote unquote agent. So when that agent is working, its context around its memory saying, yeah, you know what, I know the last 5, 6, 7 different sessions that I've had with a particular analysis, and it is dealing with malware. So I am going to be the malware analysis agent. And so if you ask me something about something else, I may not know because I am quote unquote aware of the malware context because of that. So that's how we've kind of broken it, because it actually makes it much more feasible. And on pretty much at the top, we have what we call either the supervisor or the orchestration agent, which then takes in and says, yeah, you know what, which agent should I call? Because my chain of reasoning thought will allow me to identify what the next agent or the next step is. So we kind of broke it that way. It also allows the customers then to say, I can pick and choose different elements. For example, if they're doing an incident triage analysis, they don't necessarily need to know a particular agent that does with something else. Yeah, you know what, you actually get the incident triage agent, which can call underneath some of the other capabilities, but it has the data context around the incidents, and I'm only geared towards analyzing and triaging an incident. So that's how the entire quote-unquote architecture of the product is.
Okay. Well, and so if you go back, pre-agentic AI, pre-generative AI, whatever, it's like within a team, we've always had structure something like that. Like I might be the team lead, and I've got people who work for me, and this person's job is knowing everything about ransomware. This person's job is identity security. This person's job, and they all go do their jobs, hopefully as well as humanly possible, and funnel that up to me so that I can make effective decisions that take the whole thing into account. And I think what you've described is just doing that on an agentic AI level, and I think it makes sense. And it makes sense from the perspective of, I might be able to do some kind of threat intel or security analysis using ChatGPT, but I am opening myself up to much greater risk of hallucination, misinformation, etc., by trying to ask questions or gain insight from the whole world, as opposed to having a much more limited LLM that says, okay, well, like, I'm only feeding this information about identity security. Like, all it knows is identity security, and it knows identity security inside and out. I think where it gets kind of interesting is that even though we say, okay, well, yes, this agent does this and this agent does this, and then we've got the orchestrator supervisor agent that's going to pull it all together, and that does kind of mimic what we've built previously with human teams, there is still more of a hive mind aspect to it, where it's like, well, yes, they're individual agents, but an agent's an agent's an agent, and they're all connected. They all know what the other one's doing, or they can. It's real easy for them to communicate in ways that humans didn't and never would.
No, that's 100%. So a bunch of CISOs and I were talking regarding why are they looking at agentic? Why are they evaluating agentic solutions and so on? The overwhelming response was with respect to, hey, look, at some point there is economics here, right? So I need to understand XYZ budgeting that I'm doing, and what am I going to get in terms of the capacity that I can do in terms of triage, analysis, all of those things. And if I need to have a spike event that needs to be addressed, or I need to increase the buffer capacity and so on, I cannot do it from a human standpoint. So my very first response is, how can I, very first response from the CISO standpoint was, how can I expand that resource base very elastically when I need it, and so that they can do certain things that I need them to do. By human, including human subcontractors, etc., that takes time, you cannot do it, and so on. So that was the very first thought of saying, this is why I'm looking at agentic. The second one was like, okay, once that starts to happen, the functional decomposition will help in having a feedback loop, saying, for example, from that incident triage data that can be given to some other human or agent who can now leverage that data to say, hey, you know what? I shouldn't even be looking at certain things and passing it on as an incident that needs to be triaged, because the false positive is actually pretty high, because if I keep doing that, it doesn't make sense, and so on. If the incidents triage that have said time and time again that if you're giving me an incident based on a particular log, a particular vendor, a particular system, is nothing, because it is actually false positive. We've already passed it, etc. So let's just make sure that it never happens, and so to speak. And that goes to that hive mind, which is like, instead of a person A trying to figure out with person B, the agent already communicates behind the scenes. The third reason the CISOs were like, hey, now that I'm looking at the agentic is, if I can take care of the resources and so on from a buffer capacity, Slack capacity, and so on, can I now start to identify a little bit from a strategic risk standpoint, saying future scenario and proactiveness? Because I've never been able to do it. I talk about it as a CISO, I talk about proactiveness and so on, but so much of it is based on reactive, because I get inundated with alerts, my team gets inundated with so many events that happen, whether it's through identity, whether it's through EDRs, lateral movements, whatever the case is, gets so inundated that it's still very reactive in nature. if I can enable with these agents, can I now start doing proactive? So that's why the tip of the spear for that thought process as well, which is great. I can now enable you the agents which can work as a functional decomposition, but also can, to your point, work in a high capacity if they need to, but then enable some of these tip of the spear so that they can start doing on the proactive side.
Okay. One of the other things that I've been sort of focusing on more recently is the notion of perfection of AI. Again, it makes for good headlines. People like to call out when the AI is wrong. Famously last year, I did a whole 5-minute video on ChatGPT being unable to count the number of R's in the word strawberry. That was a big thing that was going around. And so, it's not perfect. And part of that is development and just kind of evolution of the models and everything else. And part of it is actually the reality of AI, and that's the part that I think a lot of people don't get. It's not that they haven't perfected it yet, and that they'll get to a point where it's perfect. It's like, well, no, it's by definition probabilistic. It's not. It will never be perfect. It's not designed to be perfect. There's nowhere on the spectrum of development will it be perfect. And I think when CISOs, when organizations are looking at, well, do we want to trust, do we want to offload these things to AI, to agentic AI? They shouldn't be expecting perfection. They should be more realistic about their expectations in terms of saying, okay, I don't expect it to be perfect. I want it to be at least as good as the humans I would hire. If it's at least as good, if not better than the humans I would hire, then that's a win.
Yeah. No, 100%. And the thought process is very similar to, if there will be scenarios, there will be instances where, human makes a mistake, the agent makes a mistake in terms of what it thinks like. And so you need the guardrails, you need your governance, you need your processes, which you would have had anyways if there was a human acting that way. And so you need almost the same capabilities here as well. So when somebody does, when we have these discussions with some of the individuals in the industry, and when somebody says, hey, it can be completely automated, it'll be completely free. I am not in that boat yet. Maybe there may be a day, but I'm not in that boat yet, which is, hey, look, I don't think that can happen, because you need somebody at some point to take a look and say, yep, this is the right step to take afterwards. Does the confidence level keep increasing? I think absolutely, because after a certain point, even a human manager starts to trust his or her subordinates much more after a certain point. And I think that same kind of notion starts to happen in the agentic world as well. But every now and then, even the human manager wants to take a quick peek and hey, what exactly happened in last week's status? What did you do? And so on. Let me make sure that it is still kosher and so on. I think that's the same thing here as well. So I don't think it's everything is just completely agents running around, the complete agentic SOC. There is no human involved. I'm not in that boat yet.
Well, again, so I've continued to come back to the analogy or the comparison of agents are just AI proxies for humans, and not necessarily in the AI is going to steal all of our jobs away. Just in the if you're trying to imagine how do I use an agent in my organization and what does that mean for me? It's like, okay, well, just think of, would you hire a person to do this job? Okay, well, instead, give it to this agent. And in that analogy, in that scenario, if I hired someone off the street, I've sent them through 4 rounds of interviews, and I'm being generous. I've been through job interview, 6, 7, 8 rounds of interviews with some companies, but they've been vetted. I've looked at their experience and background. I've now hired them, and they're an entry-level person on my security team. I'm not going to give them an assignment and send them out the door and just trust that the results are going to be right. I'm going to follow very closely and on a daily, if not more than daily basis, to make sure that they understand what they're supposed to be doing, that they're executing it per the processes and procedures we've defined, that the results are valid, and all of those things. Now, over time, give it a month, give it a 3 months, 6 months, I'm going to develop a level of trust with that person. Like after I've monitored their activity on a day-to-day basis, and I say, okay, they understand the processes and procedures, the results they're giving me are good, I don't need to check this every single day. Even at that point, I'm still not going to say, great, I don't ever need to see you again. Check in with me on a once-a-year basis, and we'll talk about performance, compensation increases. It's like, well, no, you're still going to check. And I think organizations need to figure out what that means for them when it comes to agentic AI. Like, there's going to be much more frequent checking of results and processes out of the gate. Eventually, you're going to develop some level of trust, and you're going to loosen the reins some. You're going to say, okay, I don't need to monitor every single thing that happens here, but you still need to monitor at some frequency, like whether that's weekly, whether that's monthly. Like, someone still needs to be looking and saying, okay, are the results still valid? And I think that frequency is going to depend a lot on, like, okay, well, what does the company do? and what are you asking the agent to do? Because is it something that if I don't find out about it for a week, I can fix it? Or is it something that if I don't find out about it for a week, the company no longer exists?
Now, just like about a month ago or so, my team and I were discussing this approach for the agents, etc. Do we start creating this whole framework as well of a agent career progression, if you will? Given the fact that, you start as, your quote unquote agent junior analyst, agent senior analyst, whatever the naming convention will become. But it is very much a case of like, hey, your 30-day, your 60-day, your 90-day, so to speak, are objectives. These are the objectives you're going to be triaging. You're not going to be taking any action. Once you triage, once you find out what happens, you're going to bring it up to XYZ supervisor agent, who is going to summarize it and send it to an actual human individual to approve, disapprove, and so on. Once that happens and your quote unquote efficiency and efficacy and your error rate is within a defined parameter, you can go and progress to the agent level 2, if you will, where you are now recommending actions. You're still not taking. Initially, you were just like listing out actions. Now you're recommending actions, and the third level probably like, hey, in certain scenarios, you can actually now take an action and so on. So we're actually in a thought of that career progression model, to your point, because at any given point, there is no way to just believe 100% without taking a look at what the agent is doing.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense, and then it makes sense on like logically following the flow, and then part of me is like, okay, but going back to my like hive mind thing, it's like, while it makes sense logically to look at these things as individual agents and say, okay, treat them as if they were individual employees, there's also just like they are still all connected and they are all the same at some level. So it's like it's a little weird to say, okay, well, that's an entry level AI agent, but that one has earned the ability to do things.
My philosophy on that, and this is just a personal opinion, which is what that hive mind and the hive operation will result in is the progression of the agents from step A to step B to step C will probably happen way quicker than a human progression, because the human is still taking quite a bit of time by himself or herself learning. And this is where the hive mind just starts to get, it is a combination of 2 seniors, 1 junior. In like the next 3 days, it's a combination of like 3 seniors, 1 junior. So I think that's how it starts to progress. But that's just my personal opinion.
Okay. We're still, I mean, everything happens so fast now. And it almost seems cliche to say that, but It's true. Like it seems like every major milestone is coming faster than the previous major milestone. That said, we're still somewhat early. Like we're just kind of gaining traction on agentic AI. From your perspective, like what capabilities are there on the horizon for agentic AI that you think, like in hindsight, we'll be like, oh yes, that's obvious. We always should have done that, but like that people aren't really talking about yet. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the couple areas that maybe it's a little bit in not in the immediate future, but I think it should be looked at is very much this notion that maybe some enterprises might be thinking of is, since every component, human agent, whatever the case might be, has an identity around it now, which means it's a combination of every work artifact, every task artifact is a combination of human plus agent, which means by definition the identities, if they're working within an enterprise, across an enterprise, just expanded the attack surface vector significantly. That can be exposed, which means on the other side, a lot of the emphasis that has been happening so far is how do I leverage AI within the CTI context, within the SOC context, and so on. I think a huge emphasis will start happening in how do we start preventing AI-driven attacks and how do I secure against AI-driven attacks through AI-driven scenarios and so on. And in this capacity, identity becomes a cornerstone in terms of figuring out, okay, which identity is working on which part, which identity got breached, how do we take care of that, and so on. So that's one aspect. The second is that whole what I used to have this concept of the security value at risk, which I believe will probably come back again, which is certain scenarios that happen are really high risk. There may be a black swan event or not, but once that happens, it's a really problematic scenario. Case in point to what that you were saying, which is like existential scenario for a corporate and so on. So to start building that thing very dynamically from an AI agentic standpoint, and as some folks may say, agent force and so on, which is how do you then determine that, hey, if a physical thing happens or if a CEO or a CXO makes a comment, all the repercussions of that and what gets exposed, what doesn't get exposed, how that can be quote unquote exploited and so on, starts to becoming much more prevalent. And so the two areas is the identity and how does this entire human plus agent can be now exposed. Because now you have lateral movement, agent mimicking something, the deepfakes coming in. I believe that somebody is Tony, but it's not really Tony. It's an agent behind the scenes. What do I do, etc. So that combination. And the second one is the security value at risk, which is like which scenarios should I be looking at from an agentic standpoint that I need to cover because there is a AI on the other side, which is an adversarial network as well. So I think these are the two things that will not even near term, but I think it should be happening soon.
Okay. One of the other things that again, we're early-ish, so we'll see how it plays out. But is the notion that you're responsible for your agents? That and I forget what airline it was, but there was an airline that had deployed like a generative AI chatbot. And the generative AI gave an answer to a customer, and later the airline tried to backtrack and say, well, no, that was wrong, and they were forced to stand by what the agent said by a court, because they're like, well, no, you made the choice to make that chatbot, to make that generative AI agent speak for you, and therefore you are responsible for it. And so like, while it's not the same thing as saying, oh, well, Sachin screwed up, so I'm going to fire Sachin. There is still going to be like okay, well, someone still has to take responsibility for what the AI agent does. And at a company level, companies are not going to be able to just shrug their shoulders and go, oops, that wasn't us, that was a software glitch. That I think is part of where it gets tricky, is like, it's not I mean, first of all, I think companies probably should be held more responsible than they are when there is a software glitch. Like the same logic applies. You made the decision to deploy that software and whatever, so that you're still responsible. But in this case, even more so, it enters this gray area where it's like, well, yes, it's a technology, it's software that we deployed, but it's software that we deployed that we asked to act as a human.
Exactly. So, 100%. And that's why, because now we are giving it an identity, the moment that happens, which means that if it is acting on behalf or presenting certain things on behalf of the CXO, the corporate, etc., you've got events that may translate or transpire, and because of that, there is a value at risk, which is, hey, you know what, your agent said this, which means you're liable for X or you're liable for Y, and that's why your penalty is $100 or whatever the number is from an economic standpoint. That will start becoming extremely interesting and important to look at.
Okay. All right, so I want to kind of wind this down, but my sort of final question is just to kind of give someone listening, some sort of guidance in terms of, let's say there's a CISO out there listening to this podcast. They're feeling overwhelmed by the, both the noise in their environment and all the noise they see in the world about AI and all the magical things that AI can do for them. What would be your one piece of guidance that you'd give for how they should kind of cut through that noise and figure out what works and what doesn't in terms of adopting or evaluating agentic systems?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. The conversation that I've had, I've kind of given 3 pillars from a guidance standpoint for CISOs and operators to evaluate and take a look at AI, which is one is patience, which is you got to have a mindset of it is not a overnight shift. People may say that it is an overnight shift because of the pace at which it's going, but to truly solve the problems that you are facing, have to have that patience to a certain extent. The second piece is when you are evaluating these tool sets, do not evaluate the tool sets based on a consumer mindset, which could be very driven by a completely different thing, which is the chat GPTs of the world or etc. It's the business mindset, the business problems, which is, hey, how much do I spend on it? What are the problems that I'm facing, whether it's efficacy, whether it's capacity, and so on. And last but not the least is do a pretty good idea of the POCs, the components around those specific use cases, and then start to identify this is how my solution meets a particular vendor or a AI framework that needs to be used. Because the 3 of them kind of work hand in hand for the executive team, the CISO, to say, you know what, I know how long I need to give, which is my 2-year cycle or a 12-month cycle, whatever the case is. Second is the notion of these are the key problems that and the risks that I need to solve. And for these things, how does my other things, whether it's the process systems are working, where do I bring in AI? I think these are the 3 guiding principles that I've given to most of the industry folks, CISOs and others.
Okay. I mean, I think that's good. And I think also, I guess the only other thing I would add if I was talking to a CISO is to continue to emphasize not to expect perfection, to continue to be realistic about your expectations of what this is, both your expectations and your implementation. Because again, it goes back to 100%. You can't just set this free in your environment and then just expect that it's going to be perfect and not check on it. You should expect that it's going to make mistakes.
Hiccups, absolutely. 100%, Tony.
So, all right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me. It was a good conversation.
Thank you, Tony, as always. Much appreciated.